I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, who, as I say, is Peter Cheese, the Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. It's a great pleasure to have him with us. I'm sure he will be familiar to many of those in the room. He brings with him a huge wealth of experience and knowledge on personnel and development. He's the chair of Engage for Success, as well as being the chief exec for the CIPD. He sits on many forums linked to well-being, diversity and inclusion, routes into work and skills, flexible working and corporate governance, and sits on the board of the College for Policing. He was also previously the chair of the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. Peter writes and speaks widely on the development of HR, the future of work, and key issues of leadership, culture and organisation, people and skills. His second book was published in 2021 and explores the many factors shaping work, workplaces, workforces and our working lives, and the principles around which we can build a future that's good for people, for businesses, and for society. So it really is my great pleasure indeed to welcome Peter to this event and to give him the floor. Peter, thank you.
Thank you. So there's a big theme, and certainly in my role and the role of the profession, as Jason very well said, is a really important part of understanding how we drive productivity in this country. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through some of the background and context quite quickly, because there's some really important big themes around productivity. And then I'm going to talk about and try to frame it in a sort of business model. What are those things that we do within business related to people that fundamentally drive business outcomes and productivity? I think this is actually in your report also, Jason, but Paul Krugman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, said that productivity it's a bit like what Bill Shankly said about football. Do you remember what he said about football? It's not a matter of life and death, it's more important than that. It's a bit like what Paul Krugman's saying about productivity. But there's another quote which I often use, which is also true, which is from Albert Einstein, who said that not everything that counts is counted. Not everything that is counted counts. In other words, we tend to measure the easiest things to measure, and they're not always the most important things to measure. So if I take productivity, whilst it is certainly talked about a lot at national level, so macroeconomic level, what's our national productivity? I'm going to start with a question to all of you. How many of you really measure productivity or see it as a key measure within your business? And I recognize there's a whole range of businesses here, but how many would you put your hands up and say, yeah, this is an absolutely key measure which we focus on in our business? So a few, but not many. And my experience is exactly that. So whilst we talk about productivity at a macroeconomic level, which is, I suppose, a fairly easy calculation to make, GDP divided by the number of people in the workforce kind of measures, at a microeconomic level within our organizations, it's not an easy thing to measure. But it is important in understanding, of course, some of the key outcomes. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but just as a little straw poll, it reinforces, as I said, we use this language of productivity at a national level, but we're not always using it within our organizations. And of course, this is one of many things that are going on. I mean, the world of HR and the world I inhabit and the world many of you inhabit is fascinating. There are so many things going on. As Jason's already mentioned, a lot happening with the new government around employment rights. What we're seeing with the Employment Rights Bill is the biggest set of changes in employment legislation that we've seen in decades. And there are many other challenges that we're also confronting. We obviously have inflation still, pay pressures, cost of living crises. There's just a raft of things that we're all having to deal with within organizations. And that is a challenging context, and it's also very uncertain. And when I talk to businesses, or you hear, I don't know, groups like the CBI constantly saying, what we need is certainty. And I keep saying, you won't find it. Because we are in a very fast-changing world, and therefore a key mantra for us all in business is our ability to adapt and to be agile. Because nobody's going to come to us and say, here's all the answers that how do you implement artificial intelligence, or here's all the answers about, I don't know, cultural change. So how we adapt is a really, really important part of how we respond to all of these sorts of things. But just to rattle through, and I will rattle through because we could spend a lot of time just talking about statistics, just to echo some of the things that Jason said, I mean, we are, and have been for quite some time as a nation, low down on the productivity measures of comparable countries. And for a long time, we've been something like 20% less productive than countries like France. I don't know how many of you have spent time working in France. I spent a lot of time as a consultant working in many countries, and France was one of the countries I worked in. They are apparently we are apparently 20% less productive than them, which would say that if they didn't work on Fridays, they'd still produce the same amount as we did. And I also thought in France, I don't think they work on Fridays anyway, do they generally? They have more holidays, they have more national holidays than almost any other country in Europe, and yet, somehow, by these so-called macroeconomic measures, they appear to be a lot more productive. Which again comes back to these headlines of productivity can be things that can consume us, but are they the things that most matter? Certainly, as I said, it's a part of a growth agenda that's been talked about a lot, but I always find it intriguing when you look at these statistics and how we seem to be so relatively unproductive to other countries, yet we seem to perform economically actually pretty well. So it's therefore, and a lot of this has come from the great work of the Productivity Institute, but you can see there that where we are in the sort of flatlining of growth, to get to a point where we really are seeing that if this is the key measure, a real rise in living standards, then we've got a lot of work to do to build national productivity. And as Jason's already touched on, where this region sits, it's sort of somewhere, I summarized it as it's lagging, but it is improving relatively. But there are other very important things going on. I mean, you've got Leeds United and Sheffield United, which I'm sure will get promoted to the Premiership this season. And Newcastle, it looks like they're going to be in Europe next season. And I joke about these things, but actually, I was in France in 1998 when they won the World Cup. And they estimated as much as 2% on their GDP. It just comes back to also things like positive mental attitude. And that's, we sometimes as a country do ourselves down. And when we look at things like productivity, we think, oh my goodness, and we don't actually serve a wider purpose of building optimism and a sense of positivity. And another country I often compare us to in that regard is America. America thrive off this idea of, we can go storm the hill and we're going to do this. And of course, we've now got Trump in the White House, and his message is exactly that. We can do whatever we want, and we will storm that hill, and we will work together, and we will drive the economy, and we will make it better for all of us. And I think that is part of what we have to do. I think we've got to talk ourselves up more than we so often do as a country. And I think that, whether it's a region, and as I said, even things like sports, which can help us all all feel good to a degree, let's build on those ideas as well. And then what are the reasons for some of these things? And lots of things have been talked about. People have talked for a long time about the so-called long tail of unproductive companies. In our economy, which is not unusual in comparison to other countries, we have about 2/3 of the workforce are employed in small to medium-sized enterprises. So that is organizations of 250 or less. They also make up over 90% of all businesses. And now that's not unusual in comparison to other countries. But many of these smaller enterprises and micro-enterprises apparently are seen as part of this long tail of less productive companies. And partly because they don't always have all the resources to, if we were talking about HR practice, for example, many of these businesses they may have an HR person, but they may be doing what you have to do to comply and to pay people properly and things like that, and not always able or having the capacity to stand back and look at some of the bigger issues and how the business is becoming more productive. So we can all debate that one. I think there are elements of truth in the long tail. Also, it's been talked about a lot of, it's something to do with management and leadership, and that will be an element. But I think there's almost too much weight being put on leadership and management. Again, if I compare us to other countries that are supposedly more productive than us, I have not experienced, in having worked with lots of organizations in different countries, that somehow their management and leadership is so much better than ours. Which is not to say there aren't things we can do to focus on and improve. But again, it is only a piece of the so-called puzzle. I think there are some significant things, though, in this country about short-termism. We don't tend to look far enough down the line. And if you look at things like, and Jason's already touched on it, investment in skills has to be seen as a longer-term return. I'm not going to invest in skills today and the next day my productivity shoots through the roof and my revenues go through the roof. And part of the problem we have had for a very long time as a nation is we think too short-term. and how much we therefore invest in the business of the future, the skills and capabilities of our people, leadership and all those other things, has been a long and systemic challenge for us. And there are other things there as well, but it does bring out some of these other questions that I've already touched on. Things like what we're measuring at a macroeconomic level, what we understand at a microeconomic level, and the disconnect between those two things. How therefore, and how important it is that we measure productivity and understand it. And I think in most businesses you can look at some activities and say, yeah, I get how to measure productivity on that. But let me use an example. Call centers. All right? For a long time we've often measured outcome of call centers in a productivity sense and how many calls get answered. But is that the real metric that we need to be driving? Or is it customer service? And actually what our customers think about us. So this is where, as I said, I get back to Einstein's quote. Yeah, we can measure some of these things, but are they necessarily always the most important? Or at least on their own. Then you got this debate about correlations versus causalities. And certainly as I work, and we do work as the CIPD a great deal with universities like Sheffield and Manchester and Leeds and so forth, it's always fascinating having this conversation with academics about correlations and causality. Because we'd all love to show a direct line of connection, a causal link between the investment in the skills of my workforce and productivity and revenue outcomes. But we can't always do that, and partly because there is a time lag, or other things like engagement. I'm a passionate believer in engagement. I think it's really important. I think instinctively we'd all say, yeah, if somebody's engaged, they're more likely to want to stay with the organization in the first instance and give a little bit more of themselves perhaps to the collective good. And yet, causal links between engagement and an outcome of, say, revenue growth or productivity are not easy to establish. So often these are correlations rather than necessary causal links, and there are many intervening variables that can throw the whole thing up in the air anyway. I mean, I might be highly productive, but if I'm producing things that nobody wants, then how the hell does that help the economy or my business? So that's why this has been challenging, and it's part of the reason why I think whilst we have focused, certainly at a political level and a national level, on productivity, it is not the only thing. And it's all these other things that ultimately will drive business. And things like the lack of investment in general has been slow. It's not just investment in skills, it's investment in our workplaces and technology. And we do lag other countries in that regard. You can look at things like measures of numbers of robots that we have in our factories per head of versus the labor force is much lower than in countries like Germany, the United States, and Japan. Now, interestingly, in Japan, there's another reason why they've invested a great deal in robotics. Do you know what that is? Anybody know why they invest so much in robotics? Demographics. Exactly right. So their demographics, they are the first developed nation in the world to see their population actually declining because their birth rate's been too low. And they don't have a lot of immigration. I don't know if any of you have been to Japan, but they do not have immigration. And Korea's another country going through the same thing. So they've invested a lot in automation because they don't have the workforce. Whereas we, in this country, immigration is a big part of what makes us who we are and what we are, and I think brings so many benefits to us in terms of diversity. But arguably, because so many people have been able to come to the UK and work here, and they want to come here and work here, that may have been one of the reasons why we've invested less in technology and automation than countries like Japan. So, and indeed, the work from the TPI group has looked at elements like how much companies are investing in digital and technology and things of that nature, and we do lag. We lag as a region, we lag as a nation. And that is something that we need to think about, but it then comes back to short-termism. For many businesses, it's easier for them to employ somebody than buy an expensive piece of equipment that might not pay back for another couple of years, versus just hiring somebody, and if it doesn't work out, I can let them go. And that is part of the dynamic, the national dynamic that we've had for a long time. So, as I said, our lack of investment is a challenge. We do have a more qualified workforce, so this is comparing over 20 years from 2004 to 2024, and you will know a lot of the reasons why we have so many more people with higher levels of qualification. Because under the Blair government, they pushed the idea of having 50% of our workforce having a university degree. Now that's not necessarily all bad, but it's not translated into value in the workplace. And indeed what we now see is we've got a lot of graduates working in what historically we might have called non-graduate jobs. And they're not using all of their skills, because there's another issue which I'll show you which is exacerbating that. So how we think about education in a more balanced way of having our educational system support what we need in work and better collaboration, I think we might be hearing about a bit more about that on the panel, is a really, really important part of the dialogue, and particularly when we look at it at a regional level. How do we bring employers and education together at a local, regional level in order to sustain the skills that we need, but have a better understanding between education and the world of work as to what are actually the skills that we need. And this is an agenda actually that we're working on with national government as well, which is good to hear. So we've got a more qualified workforce, but we have growing skills mismatches. As Jason's already touched on, and there are endless surveys about this, that businesses are struggling to find the skills that they need. So there is a skills mismatch. But then, of course, from a business perspective, I think we've got to be more open-minded. I've so long said that businesses cannot expect to hire what I describe as oven-ready employees straight out of education. And indeed, increasingly what we're looking at is not so much armfuls of qualifications, because the qualification doesn't, and as data's already shown, the qualification doesn't necessarily link directly to the skills they need on the job. We're increasingly looking at what you might call the soft skills or the transferable skills. And I'll show you something like on that in a second. So we've been underinvesting in skills. And the trouble is the trend is getting worse. And there's been some recent surveys from the British Chambers of Commerce that have shown that many businesses, partly because of what happened through the budget and the increasing cost of employment, have said they're going to cut back on training further. So why is that happening? Well, one is that, as I said, we tend to be a little bit short-term in our thinking. But another is, and this is a bit of a call out to people in L&D and HR, is we haven't always been good at measuring and understanding the outcome of training and learning. Well, going back to Einstein's quote, we tend to measure what's easy to measure. So I can tell you with great certainty how many people attended training and how much they liked it. But is that the outcome? The fact that somebody liked the training, they might have liked it because they said, well, at least I didn't have to do my bloody job, which I hate, and I went on a nice training course and I had a nice lunch. So understanding the outcome of training is absolutely critical, and seeing how that links, albeit correlation or whatever, but seeing how it links then to the performance of the organization is a really critical thing for us everywhere. And it is part of how do we reverse this curve. But also how we reinvent training, frankly, in the workplace, using technology, using AI. We talk a lot now about training in the flow of work, rather than saying, well, I've got a big training program over here and I've got a problem at work, particularly with the younger generation. They're not going to say, well, I've got a problem at work, I need to understand something. They're not going to say, I know what I do. I'll go and look at the curriculum for learning and I'll sign on to a course in 3 weeks' time. No, they don't do that. They say, I'm going to go Google it, or now I'll go and look at ChatGPT and I'm going to figure it out. So we've got to create more Google-like or ChatGPT-like learning experiences and embed learning much more in the flow of work. So we've got to rethink learning in the workplace as part of this challenge. And as I said, also what this is adding up to is we also have too many low-skilled jobs. And we shouldn't be surprised if we don't have high national productivity in comparison to countries like Germany or Sweden. I mean, look at the difference in the proportion of jobs that we have in this country that only require a primary school level of education or less. And that is linked also, as I said, to this point I made earlier about our investment in the workplace, our investment in technology, and our investment in jobs, and our investment in skills. And this is one of the outcomes. So it means not only does that impact directly things like productivity, but it is also affecting many people in the workforce to the overqualified point, that we've got a highly qualified workforce, but we haven't got all the jobs that use their skills effectively. And so that sort of mismatch is also, again, very fundamental to what we need to do to drive things forwards. And then I did say I was going to touch very quickly on this idea of essential skills. So I think what we're seeing more and more is, okay, we're in a rapidly changing world of work. People now talk about a half-life of job skills of between 3 and 4 years, which means every 3 or 4 years I'm going to have to retrain half the job skills anyway. And the impact of things like AI and technology in the workplace is accelerating that trend. So it's going back to say, well, what do I really need? And what I need is people who can communicate, collaborate, work in teams, who can think for themselves, who can problem solve, who can think critically, absolutely vital, and people talk so much about this ability to think critically, even whether it's accessing information on social media or through ChatGPT. Do I believe it or not believe it? And where's my judgment that I apply to all of these things? And we know those skills can come through all sorts of sources, in life as well as through education. And I'm seeing more organizations saying, you know what, when I hand the CV to a hiring manager, I'm going to redact the qualifications because I want them to focus on these skills. And it's also part of the inclusion agenda as well. We have filtered too many people out of good jobs because we said, well, an easy sort mechanism might be to say this job requires a graduate level degree. And there are so many jobs, as I've already said before, that do not necessarily require a graduate level of degree or graduate level of qualification. So this is a really important part of the debate now. Understanding the essential skills, and we've done a lot of work as the CIPD on this. There's skills frameworks that you can use. I'd recommend you look at something called Skills Builder, which is an organization we work with a great deal. And that is a common language that works through school and into business. So when you have a young person coming out of education who says, and they are confronted by somebody in an interview saying, tell me about your leadership skills, and the young person's looking at it, I've just come out of school. But of course, we do talk about leadership, and there are ways in which young people can understand leadership skills. They might have been in the football team, or the team captain, or they might have done something, with age concern or something in the community. And it's helping them understand that those are things that we're looking for in business, and creating a common language between education and the world of work on these things. And this is a really, really important part of how we address skills in the future, and then recognizing in the workplace we're going to have to build the job skills, which goes back to my point is we cannot expect to have oven-ready employees straight out of education. We're going to have to invest a lot more in how we build their job skills. And then finally, this point about, which could be a debate all by itself, what do we think of the younger generation coming out of school and university? I've had this conversation for years, frankly. When Gen Y first started to appear, I had business leaders saying, can you tell me what's the problem with Gen Y? And I said, what do you think the problem is? And they say, oh, well, they come into work and they ask all these questions and they want my job and they don't agree with everything and they want to understand what the purpose of the business is. And I say, and why is that a problem exactly? Just as we didn't ask that, doesn't make it a problem. And those are the right questions to be asking. And then the other thing I always say to them, and you were the ones that parented them, so you look at yourself. What have we done to them all? But there are questions about younger generations and their preparedness for work. People talk about resilience and things like that. Anyway, so what I wanted to just sort of wrap up was to try to bring this together then in the context of, we said, HR and people management practices and things of that nature. There are lots of ways to explain it, but what I try to do is to put it into the context of a very basic business model. Now, this basic business model, I first came across actually working with CIMA, so the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants. And they said business is really quite simple. It's about a bunch of inputs to which you apply a bunch of activities or processes to create a bunch of outputs that ultimately creates some outcomes. Now, you could look at this as a process level. You could say, let's take recruitment. My inputs are the people that I'm trying to bring in and get into interview. My processes are, or activities are, all the interview processes that I go through. And then the induction, that creates an output, which is hopefully an employee. But that's not the final outcome. The final outcome is, did that employee perform and stay with the organization? So you can look at it at a process level or at a business level. But I thought I'd use this framework just to help explain a few thoughts around people management stuff in particular. But that's not the only part of it, because sitting around that is your operating model and your leadership and your culture and all those other things. So how those sort of processes embed themselves within a wider organizational context. And then, of course, beyond that, there's all the stuff we have to deal with externally as well. So that's a simple model. So let's just quickly run through it. So first of all, when you think, and I've already touched on a number of these ideas, when you think about what resources I need, what people I need, where am I going to get them from? What are my options? People talk about a buy, build, borrow, or bot, because we all worry about skills gaps and capability gaps. All right, so what are my options? I could hire people, I could train people, I could contract it out, I could partner with another organization that has those skills that they can bring to me. Or I can automate, that's the bot bit part of it. And that bot bit is certainly something which people are talking about more. So those are strategic choices. And if I genuinely have problems filling, and persistent problems filling certain skill gaps, are there other ways of dealing with it? And that is a very important part of what we talk about as strategic workforce planning. I've got business strategy. Now, what are the capabilities they're going to need now and in the future? And what are my options and how do I get them? And that is part of business strategy. Therefore, of course, then my ability to attract and retain the right skills. Have I opened up all my supply lines? Am I thinking inclusively? And recognizing I could bring talent in from all sorts of places, which might not have been my traditional places of recruitment. And doing that in a very coherent way. And then obviously things like, as I have these people, where and how I'm investing in skills, development and capability. So that helps build the workforce, the input, what I need in terms of skills and capabilities. There's lots of different ways that we can navigate that, and we need to think often a little bit more holistically than perhaps we have in the past. Then the activities that we ask people to do, the jobs. How do we design the jobs? What's a good job look like? We already touched on that, this construct of good work. And what surprises me in many ways, and I go to many, many organizations, is over the last 20, 30 years or so, as we've seen more and more technology appear in the workplace, it has not always resulted in better jobs. Too often, actually, it's the technology that seems to reign supreme, and then somewhere in the process we put a person into the middle of it because the technology to do what a person does is too expensive. And interestingly, the things that we do, and we talk a lot about will AI take over everything, are innate human skills. Things like multi-sensory perception, ability to patterns in random series of objects, motor skills, things of that nature, which is why you sometimes see things like automated processes or logistics warehouses with jobs stuck in the middle of them. You think, well, that is not a good job. So how do we design jobs that are good for people, get the most out of them, are good for their well-being, and create a better working culture and environment as a result? And then obviously all these other things that go into around that. How do we, what do we do to support our people? Have they got the right tools? What frustrates people greatly is if they don't have the right tools to do the job well. And it links back, therefore, to also points of engagement. I don't know if any of you have read a guy called Dan Pink's book called Drive, or the Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. Anybody read that? I'd really recommend it, right? So he consolidated an awful lot of behavioral science over many years and said, we need to remind ourselves of some basic things about what motivates people at work. He says three things: purpose, autonomy, and mastery. And the idea of autonomy in here is to say, I've often described it as, don't treat me like a muppet, right? Don't just bound me into a job with 101 rules, not tell me anything about its purpose or how it links to anything else. And it's particularly true, again, of the younger generation. They come into your organization, they say, well, so what are you all about? What's your purpose? And I know we're going to talk a bit more about that in some of the other conversations today. But things like that are actually really important. So how do we align the job and make sure people understand it in the context of everything else that's going on and what it's going to result in terms of an outcome and their role in supporting that? And of course, how we do things like resourcing and scheduling and make more flexible working. And believe me, and I'm sure many of you are working more flexibly now, we are in a whole new era of flexible working. And when you look at what attracts people to a job, it's right there in the top 2 or 3 things. Can you support flexible working? And that might be everything from hybrid working, home working, part-time working, compressed hours. People keep talking about 4-day working weeks. Who would vote for a 4-day working week? Well, I expect every hand to go up in the room, right? Do you think you will get there? Well, possibly. Right? It comes back to some of the productivity debates. In fact, if you go back 100 years, and there was the great British economist, John Maynard Keynes, 100 years ago said he thought we'd be working 15-hour weeks by now. He got that a bit wrong because a lot of people are working 15-hour days. But that just, again, makes the point. We just haven't progressed on some things that we really do need to progress on. I see no reason at all why we couldn't get to 4-day working weeks. But let's not also confuse 4-day working weeks with compressed hours. There's a lot of stuff in the media about this. 4-day working week is a 100-80-100 thing. 100% of the pay for 80% of the time for 100% of the output. If we cannot measure the output properly, then I'd be very cautious about suggesting that everybody gets a 20% pay rise, which is effectively what you'd be giving them. So it comes again back to what are we measuring? We're understanding the outputs that people are creating. So there's all of those things in the activities. But as I said, on the outputs, it is understanding what people are producing and recognizing that properly and rewarding them appropriately. And as an example of the link back to flexible working, part-time working. So think about line managers, right? So often we have an innate bias, don't we? We have an innate bias to the person that's usually there in the office before us and leaves after us and seems to be on their computer all day long. They must be really productive, they must be producing fantastic things. Versus the person who might be working home or part-time. And you hear it from politicians too, don't you? You hear it, people say, well, in fact, Stuart Rose said it last week, he's not a politician, but he's a business leader, said, but everybody needs to be in the office because they're not working if they're not. I mean, excuse me, but that's BS, right? But what we do need to do is to train our managers to understand output and not just input. Because to go to my part-time point, which part of the population tends to work more part-time than the other? Half. Women. And this is one of the reasons why women have been held back in the workplace, because they do tend to work more part-time, and then there's an inherent bias towards the idea of I'm actually judging somebody by their input, for how many hours they're working. So we've got to train managers in all of this to understand output, and then to recognize it and reward it appropriately. And that is an absolute fundamental shift I think we have to make in our business cultures. And then making sure things are aligned and accountabilities are clear. And then obviously there's a lot, and again I think we'll talk a bit more about it during the course, there are lots of things around culture and values and leadership and all those other things that help to drive a supportive environment for people where they can thrive, where they feel like they're being listened to. It's a human-centric world of work. And we have got to do more to develop our managers. I touched on a number of aspects of what we have to do there. And this isn't, all the things I said isn't about tons of money. At no point have I said, what we really need to do is invest hundreds of millions in technology. These are about basic practices of what we focus on and how we get the best out of our people. But we do need to do more to train line managers. This has been a soapbox of mine for years. We tend to promote managers because they're job skill. And that's okay, but at the same time, we've got to be also holding them to account for how they manage their people. And interestingly, environments where the job skill is most highly regarded, because I'm promoting experts, academia is an example. Healthcare is another example. We must get a better balance. But yes, I know you're the expert, but part of your job of being an expert is to train, support, and coach and mentor others. And if you're not doing that as part of your job, then I am not going to give you the top rate, and I'm not going to promote you in the ways that you might want to be. So this is a fundamental part of organizational culture and how we get a better focus on that. Therefore, putting the human at the center, I've talked about. I'm just going to wrap up because I'm very conscious of time. Importance of engagement, I've touched on. And it is a central idea, and it has been for a very long time. I talked about what Dan Pink's shown from behavioral science, but also check out Engaged Success. I mean, this idea of these four enablers, all of which are part of what I've said. So a clear strategic narrative. What am I here to do? What's the purpose of the organization? What's the strategy? What's my role in supporting those things? We all need to understand that. Engaging managers, which we talked about. Employee voice. Is anybody listening to me? Does anybody care? I've got an opinion, right? I'm doing the job. Ask me how the job's going and what I could improve with it. And those sorts of things. And of course, living the values, organizational integrity. And interestingly, particularly today, particularly with the young generations, they don't just look at their managers and say, wow, that manager's really smart. They look at their manager and say, no, but has that manager got an integrity? Are they living the values of the organization? Do they care about me? Are they coaching me and supporting me? Because that's what managers do. And as I said, we need to hold them much more to account for that. And therefore, I've talked about aspects of good work. There's a lot of work in this that's been embedded in good employment charters up and down in the country. We've been involved in a number of these so-called good employment charters or good work charters, often driven through the combined authorities and the electoral mayors. The Good Employment Charter in Manchester is a very good example of that, where they're encouraging businesses to think about these things in different ways. What creates a good job, and how do I cement that in my organization? And then finally, and this is a subject which could consume us for not just today, but for many years to come. Is this going to be the silver bullet? Well, you notice I left this to last. You notice that I said, actually, there's all these other things that we need to be doing well. Because if you just shove in AI and technology into an organization that's not doing these things well, you will not get the benefit. And there's been too much, actually, to go back to an earlier point I made. In my experience over the years, of all this technology we shoved into businesses, and we haven't trained people to use it properly. Many people have almost felt like they're fighting the technology. And we've really got to think about how we enable it. But I'm going to ask you one final question related to AI. How many of you have a sort of strategy in your organization about how you're going about AI? A few, which is fine, because that is exactly where we are. A few have, many at the other end of the spectrum say, I'm not touching that stuff with a barge pole until other people have figured out how to use it properly. And then there's a whole bunch in the middle. But my final question to you is, okay, so you don't have an organizational strategy, but how many of you are using AI, particularly Gen AI tools? Pretty much everybody. And if you're not, get onto it. Get ChatGPT on your phone. I use a tool called Perplexity. They are brilliant, even if you just use it as a high-powered search engine. And the more we use these things ourselves, the more we can help to understand how it might impact the world of work. So you may not have a strategy, but believe you me, that little straw poll, if you ask your own organization, they'd say the same thing. We're starting to use this. So how do we help them understand? How do we engage our workforces? And this is the key point about this stuff. Engage our workforces on how they think we can enable the business through technology. So that's it. I'm a couple of minutes over, but quick canter through both a context of what's important, but also hopefully, when I tried to put it into a business model rather than giving a big shopping list of here's 58 things you should think about, but to put it into a context of any business and where are the different interactions that we need to think about. And I said none of these things need to cost us loads of money. They're about points of focus. They're about certainly things that we should perhaps need to do to train better. And those are the things ultimately that will help your people thrive. And if your people thrive, your organization will thrive as well. So let me leave it there. Thank you.
Peter, thanks very much. That was amazing. That was so insightful and covered an awful lot of ground, so thank you very much. That really set the session up very well. We've got time for 2 or 3 questions, if anybody has one. Somebody there, and then Simon.
Hello, hello. I'm just coming with my roving mic.
Yeah, I'm Nick Pearson, I'm the Chief Executive of Sheffield Occupational Health Advisory Service. So we're funded by Public Health to give advice to employees about to stay in work. I think you touched upon it a little bit, but we're particularly concerned by the number of accidental managers in organisations. Because when we're asking people who come to us for advice, they about 30% say they are in conflict with their manager, and that's the driver for them to being off sick. So I don't know whether you want to anything you can expand upon accidental managers, because I was talking to somebody from one of the largest organisations in Sheffield last week about accidental managers, and they said, we've got loads of them.
No, thanks, Lou, for your question. First of all, great that you work in occupational health. It's so important, and it is an area that we need to grow in terms of its support for organisations everywhere, for all the reasons you said. If I'm honest, I'm not terribly fond of that term, an accidental manager. We promote people, right? We make them managers. And as I said, the issue we've had is that we've promoted them for the reasons of their job competence, and we then not train them well enough in their role of looking after and managing people. And it's absolutely fundamental, and you're quite right, and you will see it through your work, that so many people, it's stress issues, anxiety issues, they're feeling they're being bullied by their manager or not being listened to at all, and the manager doesn't care about them. We can only fix that if we train our managers and then reward and recognize them far more for that aspect of their job than we've done in the past. As I said, it's been a soapbox of mine for many, many years, and it's extraordinary. The biggest companies to the smallest companies, we just don't do that enough. And that, I think, is what I would emphasize, and I think that's what you're pointing to as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Simon?
Thanks. I'm James Alexander from the Local Government Association. What you outlined was very interesting, but it sounded like a cycle of decline in terms of lack of international competition, in terms of comparative advantage, the high amount of low-skilled jobs, reducing skills funding, lack of investment in infrastructure, and so on. And what I wanted to understand is apart from the practices that you've outlined that can make internal organisations better, what could councils do to actually help break that cycle of decline rather than just be positive and talk up an area while they're also putting up car parking charges and making businesses and things more difficult?
No, thanks for your question, James, and we've worked quite a lot actually with the LGA. I think there are quite a lot of things. The one thing I didn't do is there's a raft of stuff coming down the track, right, from government proposals that hopefully will help us address some of these questions. From a local government perspective, I am a very, very big believer in regionalisation of these challenges, right? So because most people get employed in places where they're close to where they live. So how do we bring, touched on it briefly, but how do we bring education, employers and local government together to say, how do we address some of these challenges together? Because as you will know, James, also through, not just through government, but particularly through national government schemes, when government puts money into skills development programs, 9 times out of 10 it doesn't get spent. And we know we've done a lot of work, some of the work we've done with local government is through what we call a people skills initiative. So using volunteers or independent consultants, people like John, across our own membership, because they're all HR experts, to support small businesses. Because, as I touched on, I think earlier, this so-called long tail, it's often because they don't have the resources. And it's not because they're bad employers or bad people. How do they become more aware of these things and the things that they do, or as a business leader or a founder of a business, what my role is in supporting all of these things? So I'm very much to say, first of all, I believe in this regionalisation, and the government, as you know, at the centre is talking about this. So FE is another very big part of this, and some of the institutes we talk about. I think local government can be a facilitator of a lot of that. And what we found, interestingly, with this people skills program that we were doing, we trialled it in Stoke, Glasgow, and Hackney. And what we found was that the channels to small businesses varied. Because small businesses often are so heads down, they don't even know where to turn. So I think it was at Stoke and Glasgow where the council was a very strong interlocutor, if you will, where they'd said, look, come to us and we can help point you in the right direction. Connect into growth hubs or whatever it might be. So I think councils can play a really profound role in this, being a facilitator, being that point which businesses in your area can connect to, where you can then point them to where they can get help and support. And there are some very good examples of that happening across the country. Interestingly, in Hackney, it wasn't the council at all. It does vary, right, across the country. Is it the council that small businesses would naturally turn to? And if it's not, how do you become part of that infrastructure? Does that help? Yeah.
Thank you. Time for one more very quick one, if that's okay. If anybody has a very quick question.
Good morning. I'm Eloise from Mind in Leeds. I saw your post on LinkedIn regarding EDI and the rhetoric that is happening across the world at the moment. What is the CIPD going to do in response to all of this in terms of research and supporting organisations? Because it's terrifying.
Yeah. No, thanks, Eloise. First of all, great organisation, Mind. We do a lot with them. I sit in their mental health at work forum. It's so important. It's a great work. The DEI, EDI, the diversity and inclusion agenda has become toxic in some regards. I mean, obviously what Trump has been saying hasn't helped quite clearly. I'm sure some of you have been following some of the stuff. But what we're doing in terms, so your questions around our research. So we've actually been on this agenda for the last 6 months or so. And I've been commenting on it for longer than that to some degree, we've got to make sure that we orient it to really point to the positive business outcomes. Because sometimes where it's gone off a little off track, and there are plenty of detractors, right? We have to be honest, plenty of detractors, both of some of these initiatives, but also HR in general. HR is not always top of the pops when it comes to many business leaders. So evidence-based and outcomes-driven. We talk about being principles-led, evidence-based and outcomes-driven. So we should stick to the principles. Why do we do these things? And why would it be important for business? And incidentally, for many businesses who believe in inclusion, they do see it as part of their role. I've always said that businesses should see themselves as a responsible business that is also part of the communities in which they are part of. And if you do that well, back to the question about local government, local connection, and people signing up to good employment charters, that is an example of doing that, right? But I think we've got to be, therefore, very clear on the principles, why this is important now. We've got to have that evidence that shows the difference it makes in terms of your ability to attract and retain all the skills that you need. And as I said, have a workforce that reflects your communities and the customers that you serve. Because if I'm honest, part of the challenge which we've seen is it's become more and more complex. It's more layered, and then we've got all this intersectionality questions, and then we've got all these people saying, well, I want a community that talks about X or Y or Z. We've got protected beliefs. I got more involved last year than I ever thought I would in debates about trans and non-binary versus gender critical. And you can't reconcile those two. They are different perspectives. And the question for us all is, so how much do I have to dive into the detail of those things in my workplace? Or to take another example, I've had organizations saying to me, should I set up an ERG, an employment resource group, or a discussion forum on Gaza. And I say, not in a million years. You start that, then you've got to have one for Israel, and where does that stop? Businesses are not political forums, unless you are a lobbying organization. Equally, I would say, we're not social workers either. I'm a big fan of occupational health and well-being and all those sorts of things, but we can't solve all of these things. We have to work within an infrastructure. And I think we've gone a little far down a track that says we've got to appease all the voices and we've got to deal with all these issues, when in reality we can't, and it's too complex, and we're asking too much of our managers. So that's what that was the point of my post and the point of a lot of the research that we're doing. And we have been interviewing a lot of organizations over the last 6 months, and the next 2 or 3 months you're going to see that research come out. But it's going to reinforce those points. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for your questions, and Peter, thank you again for
Thanks,
excellent keynote.
Thank
Thank you.